会在节目中为大家进行详细的介绍。感谢大家今天来关注我们华尔街论坛的节目。刚才很多网友问到了有关于缅甸北部的问题那我们的一位同事小安特别关注亚洲问题，他最近特别制作了一个节目，讲到缅甸现在的政局、军政府的角力，以及缅甸北部的情况到底是怎样的。在今天节目结束之后的华尔街联报，请大家不要错过。同时说到科技和经济方面的消息，大家可能注意到，现在各大机构是纷纷上调了中国今年的 GDP 预期，而摩根大通对于中国今年股市也做出了上调回价这样的评价，认为今年未来12个月随着政策的加力，中国股市可能会出现6%到8%的增长。消息面提振下，整个亚洲股市也有变化起色。除了这一些经济方面的消息我们还注意到的是科技方面的一系列消息。之前我们在节目中就为大家在猜测到底双11今年成交量以及销售额是增加还是减少。一方面，现在中国消费复苏乏力，大家可能会猜测是不是消费的热情不像往年那么高了。同时消费的形式也更加多元了，传统的电商网购是不是会受到打击？但是从目前的成绩来看不管是阿里也好还是京东也好，在销量方面都是继续创下了新高。当然我们知道今年的折扣据说也是特别的狠，因此总销售额是多少现在我们还没有看到同时科技方面，我们今年看到一条特别有趣的消息，就是中国著名的长江存储在美国的法院里起诉了美国著名的芯片巨头美光，原因是认为美光对于自己的知识产权构成了侵权行为，侵犯了8项专利。这到底是怎么回事？关注科技新闻的朋友一定不要错过。以上就是我们为大家整理的最近的新闻详细内容。感谢艺人，感谢甜甜，感谢 JZ， 感谢如是我们，感谢 Blues Fan， 好像是一位新网友来自加拿大，谢谢您的支持。感谢我是 ZZ， 谢谢这些网友对于我们的支持。稍后华尔街联报继续为您带来过去24小时的最新新闻评论和报道。
外交大臣，作为前英国首相，他的相关讯息与背景。大卫·卡梅伦成为新任英国外交大臣。他曾于2010年至2016年担任英国首相，并在2016年因英国脱欧公投结果而辞职。大卫·卡梅伦在他的任期内有一些重要的成就和争议。他的政府实施了一系列的经济改革，包括削减公共支出，以减少国家债务，并推动私有化政策。他的政府也实施了一些社会政策，如同性婚姻合法化。然而，他的任期也充满了争议。他的经济政策被批评为对低收入群体不公，而他的移民政策也引起了一些争议。但最重要的是，他在2016年提出的英国脱欧公投，结果是大多数英国公民投票赞成脱欧，这导致他辞去了首相职务，并引发了一系列政治和经济的震荡。总的来说，大卫·卡梅伦的首相任期有其成就，但也有其争议。他的脱欧公投决定对英国的未来产生了深远的影响。大卫·卡梅伦相关的重要人物和事件。大卫·卡梅伦在2010年到2016年期间担任英国首相，并在2016年的英国脱欧公投后辞职。以下是对他的功过的一些评价。一、经济改革。卡梅伦在2010年首相任内，面对金融危机后的惊悚困境，推行了一系列的经济改革和紧缩政策，成功的将英国的经济带出了低迷。二、社会议题。他支持同性婚姻，并在其任内成功的使同性婚姻在英国合法化。英国脱欧。卡梅伦在2016年举行了英国脱欧公投，结果以微弱多数决定离开欧盟，这引发了一系列的政治和经济问题，并最终导致他的辞职。二、紧缩政策。虽然他的经济紧缩政策成功的稳定了经济，但也导致了社会福利的削减，使许多弱势群体受到影响。相关的重要人物和事件。一、陈述。奥斯本。作为卡梅伦的财政大臣，他在紧缩政策的制定和执行中扮演了重要角色。二、英国脱欧公投。这是卡梅伦任内的重大事件，也是他政治生涯的转折点。三、特蕾莎梅。在卡梅伦辞职后，特蕾莎梅接任了英国首相，并承担了处理英国脱欧的重任。大卫·卡梅伦对于今天有什么影响？大卫·卡梅伦作为前英国首相的功过，以及他可能对今天的影响。大卫·卡梅伦在2010年至2016年期间担任英国首相，他的领导期间有一些重要的里程碑。 首先，他是第一位领导联合政府、保守党和自由民主党的首相，这在英国政治历史上是相当罕见的。他的政府实施了一系列的经济改革，包括削减公共开支和提高税收，以减少国家的赤字。然而，卡梅伦最为人所知的决定可能是2016年的英国脱欧公投。这次公投是他为了平息保守党内部的分歧，并阻止选民转向英国独立党而提出的。然而，结果是公投以微弱多数赞成脱欧结束，这导致了英国政治、经济和社会的重大变革。公投结果出来后，卡梅伦选择辞职。卡梅伦成为新任外交大臣，他的过去经验和决定肯定会影响他的领导风格和政策。他可能会更加专注于国际关系，特别是在脱欧后的英国与欧盟的关系。此外，他的经济政策可能也会影响他的外交政策，尤其是在贸易和援助等问题上。大卫·卡梅任首相时的政绩。大卫·卡梅伦于2005年当选为英国保守党领袖，2007年开始担任英国首相，直到2016年辞职。他在任期间的主要政绩包括：一、经济改革。在英国经济危机时期，卡梅伦提出了一系列的经济改革措施，包括削减公共开支、改革福利制度、提高退休年龄等，成功的帮助英国经济恢复增长。二、社会改革。他推动了一系列的社会改革，包括同性婚姻合法化、提高最低工资、扩大免费幼儿园名额等，提高了社会公平性和包容性。三、教育改革。他大力推动教育改革，提高教育质量，包括扩大自由学校的规模、改革高等教育资助制度等。四、英国脱欧公投。他在2016年举行了英国脱欧公投，虽然结果是英国决定脱欧，但这次公投体现了他对民主原则的尊重。五、外交政策。他积极参与国际事务，包括在利比亚危机中扮演重要角色，推动对叙利亚的军事干预等。然而，卡梅伦的政策和决策也遭到了一些批评，包括他的经济紧缩政策被指加剧了社会不平等，他的脱欧公投决策被认为导致了英国社会的分裂和不确定性。大卫·卡梅任首相时的败笔。一、2016年公投脱欧决定，这可能是卡梅伦最大的败笔。他在2016年举行了一场公投，询问公众是否希望英国脱欧，结果以微弱多数赞成离开欧盟，这导致了英国政治和经济的巨变，并最终导致他的辞职。二、社会服务削减。在他的领导下，英国的公共服务包括医疗、教育和警察经历了大规模的削减，这些削减引发了公众的广泛不满。三、英国的不平等加剧。在卡梅伦的领导下，英国的贫富差距加剧，他的政策被批评为偏向富人，而对中低收入者的支持不足。四、对难民的态度。卡梅伦的政府在处理难民问题上的态度也引发了争议，他的政府被批评为对难民的处理不人道，没有提供足够的支持。五、学费上涨。卡梅伦政府在2010年决定大幅度提高大学学费，这使得许多年轻人的教育成本大大增加，引发了广泛的抗议。大卫·卡梅的真实去世。大卫·卡梅 David Cameron 是英国的前首相，他在2010年到2016年期间担任此职务。以下是一些关于他的真实去世。一、大卫·卡梅在牛津大学的时候是戏剧社团的一员，并且曾经在一部名为《Romeo and Juliet》的戏剧中扮演过角色。二、卡梅在学生时代是牛津大学的保守党成员，并在1980年代初期成为了保守党研究员。三、他是英国历史上最年轻的首相，仅次于19世纪的罗伯特·皮尔。四、卡梅是英国首位通过全民公投而辞职的首相。这次公投是关于英国是否应该离开欧盟，也被称为脱欧公投。五、卡梅在他的自传中透露，他在2005年保守党领导人竞选中，他的竞选策略之一就是尽可能的让自己看起来正常。他认为这能让他在选民中获得更多的支持。六、卡梅曾在一次公开演讲中错误地引用了英国历史上的一个重要日期，他将英国在二战中与纳粹德国宣战的日期说成了1940年，实际上是1939年。这个错误引起了一些人的嘲笑。七、大卫·卡梅是一位狂热的板球迷，他曾在接受采访时表示， 他最喜欢的放松方式就是观看板球比赛。卡梅在2015年引发了一场被称为猪门的丑闻。当时有一本书揭露他在牛津大学时参加一个秘密社团的仪式中，曾经对一只猪的头做出了不雅行为。这个故事在社交媒体上引发了广泛的讨论和嘲笑。大卫·卡梅的个人经历。大卫·卡梅 David Cameron 是英国的政治家，曾任英国保守党党领以及英国首相。他在2005年至2016年期间担任保守党党领，2005年至2016年期间担任英国首相。大卫·卡梅于1966年10月9日出生于英国伦敦，他的父亲是一位股票经纪人。他在伊顿公学接受教育，然后在牛津大学布雷奇诺斯学院学习哲学、政治和经济学。卡梅在大学毕业后，曾在保守党的研究部门工作，之后在电视公司 Carlton Communications 担任公共事务主管。他在2001年被选为威特尼选区的议员，2005年当选为保守党党领。2005年至2010年，卡梅领导保守党在野党阵营。2010年保守党在大选中获胜，卡梅成为首相。他领导的政府实施了一系列的财政紧缩政策，以应对全球金融危机带来的挑战。2016年，卡梅主导了一场全民公投，以决定英国是否应该离开欧盟。公投结果显示，多数英国人支持脱欧，这导致卡梅辞去了首相和保守党党领的职务。退休后，卡梅担任了几个商业和慈善组织的顾问或领导职务，包括担任一家人寿保险公司的顾问和一家基金会的主席。他还发表了自己的回忆录，详细描述了他的政治生涯。谢谢您收看六度百科，这是由一群科学家、经济学家、专业媒体人、工程技术人员合作制作的百科类节目。这些内容并不一定反映六度百科团队的立场，亦不能作为任何决策的建议。六度百科内容涉及诸多知识领域，我们努力使其内容真实、专业，不存在预设立场。如果受众发现内容有误，赞同或反对六度百科内容，请在我们的节目留言区发表您的高见。欢迎大家到六度世界 六度 World 阅读我们的更多内容，参与六度聊天区的讨论。请订阅我们的频道，给我们的节目点赞，谢谢。
大家好，我是华尔街电视的小安，为大家主持一档新的节目《亚洲大眼睛》。什么样的内容，您慢慢看就知道了。那在短短的几天时间之内，缅甸军政府失去了对接壤中国边境地区的大部分控制权。BBC 中文报道，在得到其他反政府武装的支持下，掸邦3支民族武装在协同攻击下，占据了数十个政府军据点，夺取了承载大多数往来中国贸易的边境关卡与公路。这是政府军自2021年2月夺权以来所遭受的最严重挫败。在军方对抗其灾难性政变所引发的武装事件长达2年半之后的今天，这支军队显得虚弱，甚至有了击败他的可能性。军政府以空袭和炮轰来还击，迫使成千上万的平民百姓离开家园。然而，他无力调拨增援，遑论收复失地。那据信，掸邦政府军司令员昂觉伦准将是已知阵亡的数百名官兵之一，他是自政变以来在作战期间阵亡的最高级别将领。让这起袭击更具重要性的是，在掸邦活动的这一支装备精良的民族武装，明确地将自己以及其军事行动向更大范围的反叛运动靠拢。这些反叛武装寻求推翻军政府，重建民族管制。然而，尚有其他因素在左右大局。这3支叛军长期虎视眈眈，谋求拓展所控疆土。更关键的是，本来作为牵制力量的中国，并未阻止这场行动在其边境附近推进。这也许是因为北京对军政府在诈骗园区泛滥掸邦的问题上不作为而感到失望。成千上万的中国和别国公民被强迫在这些园区工作。那叛军声称，他们的其中一个目标就是要扫荡诈骗园区。回望2021年，军队和警方暴力镇压反对政变的和平示威，反政府活动人士认为他们已经别无选择，继而号召全国武装起义，对抗军阀。许多活动人士逃到缅甸与泰国、中国和印度接壤被民族武装控制地区，寻求获得他们普遍缺乏的军事训练与军备供应。那一些实力雄厚的民族武装，例如克伦族、克钦族， 克伦尼族和亲族决定与民选政府被军事政变夺权后成立的民族团结政府 NUG 结盟。并非所有的民族武装都有结盟，尤其是党邦的各派系，这也与中国和泰国接壤的土地辽阔而无法无天。那党邦也许最为人熟悉的是其全球规模数一数二的非法毒品产地，但赌场与诈骗园区最近也在这里飞速发展。那自1948年缅甸自英国独立以来，党邦一直饱受武装冲突和贫困的摧残，分裂成不同军阀、毒枭与民族武装的山寨，他们互相攻打对方，也跟政府军对垒。那党邦是缅甸最大的少数民族群体，有2支敌对民族武装声称代表当地，但近年来再有4个小型民族建立了强而有力的武装组织。能力最强的要算是佤族，他们配备现代军备，有约2万兵力，且得到中国撑腰。其次是华裔果敢族，他们的武装活动源远流长。位于偏远山区的德昂族，其部队自2009年成立以来迅速壮大。还有洛开人，他们其实来自缅甸另一边的洛开邦，但有许多人移民到东面后，协助组建洛开军，如今成为了缅甸数一数二的精锐民间武装。那佤族人在1989年与缅甸军政府达成停火协议，一般会避免介入武装冲突。他们宣称在军政府与反叛武装之间的冲突中将保持中立，但他们被认为是全国各地诸多反军政府抵抗组织的多数武器来源。而余下的3支民族武装——果敢缅甸民族民主同盟军 MNDAA、德昂民族解放军 TNLA以及洛开军组成了所谓的3兄弟联盟。自政变以来，他们多次共同与政府军冲突，但总是为了他们自身的领土利益，而非为了支持民族团结政府。这3支反叛武装谨慎地给来自缅甸各地的异议人士提供庇护、军事培训和部分军备。但毕竟他们地处中国边境，他们还要顾及中国的顾虑，也就是确保边境地区稳定和维持贸易流通。中国在外交上支持缅甸军政府与民族团结政府保持距离。而今年6月，受中国施压，3兄弟联盟同意跟政府军和谈，只是很快便谈判破裂。那尽管如此，联盟表面上还是跟更大范围的内战保持距离。他们势如破竹，一些政府军师团未打一枪便举手投降。那联盟声称已夺取超过100个据点和4座城镇，包括设有边境关卡的清水河和信威。那信威正好处于通往木姐的公路交叉口上，而木姐是面向中国的主要国门。联盟武装炸毁桥梁，防止政府军增援力量进入，又把老街镇重重包围。这里有许多由军政府关联家族运营的诈骗园区。那受困老街的外国公民估计成千上万，当地居民需排队购买仅余的粮食，市内日趋混乱。中国已经警告其公民从就近边境口岸紧急撤离。那3兄弟联盟就称，如今他们的终极目标与民族团结政府相同，就是要推翻军政府。那面对着全副武装的政府陆军和空军，民族团结政府的武装志愿者拼死对抗了一段时间。民族团结政府对联盟接连报捷感到雀跃，甚至说他们的武装斗争得到了新的力量。支持民族团结政府的人民防卫军 PDF， 无论是装备还是经验都比不上党班的各派武装，但他们也乘着政府军似乎处于劣势，趁机在党班附近发起了攻击，并首次从军政府手中夺取了地区首府的控制权。在老街某次事故导致中国对缅甸军政府彻底失去耐性之后，3兄弟联盟总会小心翼翼地部署其攻势。过去1年，中国政府持续向缅甸军政府施压，要求加大力度取缔主要由华人犯罪集团运营的诈骗园区。园区如何残暴对待被人口贩子诱拐到当地禁闭的受害人遭曝光，让北京难堪。在中方的压力下，像佤邦等缅甸边陲民族武装同意向中国公安移交涉嫌参与诈骗活动人员。今年8月至10月之间，已经有超过4000人被遣送到中国，但老街各大家族对于是否要结束为他们创收数十亿美元计的行业感到犹豫。 BBC 引述当地消息，10月20日，老街本来有人试图解救数千名被禁闭的人员，结果出了乱子。诈骗园区的门卫据信打死了几名试图逃走的人，结果隔壁中国市区云南临滦的政府发来了措辞强烈的抗议信，要求严惩肇事者。三兄弟联盟看准时机，企鹅工资，并许诺瓦解这些诈骗园区，以安抚中国。那中国公开呼吁停火，但联盟的发言人就称，他们并未接收到中国政府要求停止战斗的直接通信，但在预期军政府终将倒台下，他们的长远目标还是寸土必争。民族团结政府许诺，只要军政府倒台，便会让联盟参与缅甸联邦新架构的谈判，攻城略地，有利于联盟增强谈判筹码。那德昂民族解放军长期希望将其势力范围扩展到宪法所允许的德昂自治区以外。那民族民主同盟军希望收复2009年丢失给政府军的老街以及其相邻边境的地带。当时的军事行动正是由军政府最高领导人敏昂莱将军所率领。那目前所有的目光都投放在若开军 AA 身上，他们迄今只支持在掸班的战斗，但其兵力集中在若开邦，且已控制了当地许多城镇和村庄。要是他们决定攻打政府军，军政府将顾此失彼，危险万分。德昂民族解放军的一位发言人对 BBC 就称，他们不再认为军政府具有任何正当性，与之谈判并毫无价值。那民主武装跟政府军就算能达成任何协议，恐怕都会被未来的民选政府作废。在新联邦制度下，为各自民族赢得宪法承认的国家地位，是德昂族、果敢族和佤族的共同目标。那透过加入战斗，这些民族武装也许会促使缅甸军事统治走向终结，但他们的报复将无可避免地跟掸班内其他武装产生矛盾。这预示着那些试图为缅甸描述未来民主蓝图的人将要面对怎么样的重重挑战。谢谢大家，这就是本期的亚洲大眼睛，希望听到您的意见，留言在节目下方。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。现在网络上杀猪盘可以说是层出不穷，不知道观众朋友有没有在冲浪的过程中遇到过杀猪盘呢？如果是杀猪盘，您能否辨别出来呢？那么有很多没有辨别出来的朋友，很不幸被骗了几十万甚至上百万。华尔街日报最近就发表了一篇深入报道，北京已经开始注意到这个现象，并且开始严厉打击杀猪盘。杀猪盘通常是来自东南亚的骗子组织，但是他们往往是由中国的犯罪分子所控制的，通过网络和社交平台与世界各地的人建立联系。通常他们会盗用帅哥美女的照片来伪装成是自己的账号，然后寻找目标，并且耐心建立关系，有时候甚至是恋爱关系，然后哄骗目标对象进行虚假投资。他们一开始会制造投资不断增长的假象，让受害者汇出更多的钱，然后他们就会消失了。最近几个月，中国为打击杀猪盘的泛滥，采取了最严厉的措施，将执法触角伸到了境外，大规模逮捕了数千人，主要目标是中缅边境地区。几十年来，缅甸等边境地区一直以赌博、贩卖毒品、贩卖野生动物和贩卖人口出名，现在他们成为了杀猪盘的窝点。他们一般在隐秘的大院里面进行活动，其中许多大院是由中国逃犯所经营的。他们从中国逃到了法律疏于管理的地方，并且每年从中国公民或者在海外的华人那里骗取了数十亿美元。美国财政部在今年9月还警告美国人要警惕这些骗局。除了缅甸的偏远地区，柬埔寨的一些赌博中心也有这些杀猪盘的落脚点。柬埔寨当局曾经在中国警方的协助下进行了零星的突击活动，但是问题依然存在。美国研究人员表示，几年来中国几乎没有对他们进行过执法。在疫情期间，边境贸易停止，互联网使用激增，因此杀猪盘行业开始蓬勃发展。杀猪盘的背后还加剧了人口贩卖问题，很多骗子本身就是人口贩卖的受害者，他们被虚假的招聘广告诱骗到了国外，并且被扣留了工资和护照。联合国人权办公室称，在缅甸可能有超过12万人被迫充当了骗子，在柬埔寨则有10万人。一位人口贩卖的受害者告诉《华尔街日报》， 他接受的训练是先花几周的时间或者几个月的时间来养肥受害者，而所谓的养肥就是指取得受害者的信任，然后再宰杀他们。这名受害者表示，他当时是看到了一个招聘网站上的广告后，接受了在柬埔寨从事客户服务的工作，但是一到柬埔寨，他就被赶到了西哈努克一个类似监狱的楼房当中，在那里他在暴力的威胁下被迫从事诈骗工作。他说他有一个负责培训他的人给他提供了一部智能手机，里面预装了假冒的社交媒体账户，一份目标受害者名单，里面还包含他们的联系方式以及各种聊天要用到的脚本。而所幸的是，几周之后，这名受害者说服了一名送货司机，帮助他逃出了犯罪窝点。联合国毒品犯罪问题办公室的分析师表示，中国最近开始发出信号，表示将会不再容忍杀猪盘。今年8月，中国与3个邻国发起了特别联合行动，并且向控制缅甸偏远地区的武装组织施加更大压力，说服他们追捕并且遣返了近5000名涉嫌从事非法活动的中国公民。中国当局已经锁定了几个属于缅甸但是完全由华人武装自治的边境地区，这些地方往往吸引了中国公民的大量投资，包括合法投资和非法投资。许多中国人，包括逃犯，都生活在这些法外之地。汉语和人民币在这些地方很常见，这其中就包括被称为缅甸小中华的佤邦。它位于中国的西南边境，北京对该地区拥有很大的影响力。该地区是少数民族佤族人的家园。1949年新中国成立后，中缅两国在1960年签订中缅边境条约，这些居住了华人的地区正式成为缅甸的领土。但是事实上，这些区域随后还是由华人武装组织来管理的。当地的官方语言是中国西南方言，法定货币是人民币。当地人也习惯使用中国的手机卡，习惯通过微博、微信等中国社交媒体来发放和接受资讯。当地连学校的教材都是使用中国人教版的教科书，因此这个地方就被称为缅甸小中华，也成为中国通往缅甸的主要经济门户之一。独立研究人员称，佤邦联合军是该地区的实际领导者，指挥着一支2万多人的部队，装备有便携式地对空导弹和装甲车等中国现代化装备。近2个世纪以来，该地区一直是鸦片的主要产地，近几十年来也已经成为人工合成毒品的主要产地。美国财政部于2003年将佤邦联合军列入黑名单，并且制裁了数十家与该组织有关联的个人和企业，称其为东南亚最强大的贩毒组织。除了毒品交易之外，现在佤邦联合军和其他犯罪网络越来越多地转向了诈骗。根据中国国家媒体2022年的一份报告，在过去1年中，中国总共封堵了210万个诈骗网站和价值516亿美元的可疑交易。中国政府已经警告公民提防可疑的回扣提议、投资计划以及自称代表公司或执法部门的人来主动联系你。北京开始认真清理杀猪盘的第一个迹象出现在今年的9月初，当时中国与佤邦联合军合作策划了为期2天的突袭行动，最终有1000多名嫌疑人被送回中国境内，并且被中国警方拘留。随后，中国加大了对该组织的打击力度。10月12号，中国公安部称，已经对2名被指控领导网络诈骗的佤邦高级官员发出了逮捕令，他们就是佤邦建设部部长陈延班和佤邦孟宁县的市长肖延全。根据当地媒体报道，这2位官员分别持有中国云南和中国广东的身份证。4天之后，佤邦联军称这2人已经被解除职务，他们现在下落不明。而在同一天，中国当局表示，已经在2天前从缅甸移交了2349名电信诈骗犯罪嫌疑人，这是一次性移交人数最多的一次。中国称，自今年年初开始镇压行动以来，已经从缅甸遣返了4666名犯罪嫌疑人。欧洲智库国际危机组织的缅甸问题专家表示，无论是从哪个角度来看，这都是一次重大行动，说明了它对中国和中国公民的影响，以及中国政府现在对待此事的态度。但是抓捕4000多人的规模 可能还是远远不够的。中国中央电视台在今年8月就曾经报道称，缅北与缅东至少有1000个诈骗团伙，每天有超过10万人从事电信诈骗活动。而当地居民表示，尽管中国加强了打击，但是这些团伙仍然在继续蓬勃发展。他们喜欢寻找一些擅长使用电脑并且擅长交流的人，让他们充当网络诈骗者。专家表示，尽管中国可能会加大对边境地区犯罪分子的打击力度，但是由于诈骗利润丰厚，诈骗团伙很可能会寻找更加肥沃的土地，那些执法更加不严的偏远地区可以继续经营诈骗活动。这些团伙基本上不会轻易消失，因为世界上还有许多法律脆弱的地方是他们可以利用的。所以在节目的最后也提醒观众朋友，天上不会掉免费的帅哥美女，大家一定要保持警惕，不要因为几张擦边照片就迷失了方向。以上就是今天新风视线的全部内容，感谢您的收看，这里是华尔街电视，如果喜欢记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道，我们下期节目再见。
各位观众朋友们，大家好，欢迎回到华尔街电视，这里是沙伦一报节目，我是节目主持人沙伦。在这一期节目里呢，我们要来讲一讲灵魂食物。什么是灵魂食物呢？灵魂食物是一种源于美国南方的非裔美国文化的烹饪传统，起源于奴隶制度时期。并非所有南方的食谱都可以被归类为灵魂食物，但所有灵魂食物都有其根源于美国南方。这种烹饪的主要特征之一是强烈的味道，呈现出丰富的舒适食物，就是 comfort food。同时呢，融合了辣、咸还有甜的口味。流行的灵魂食物调味料包括黑胡椒、辣椒粉、红辣椒、大蒜粉，还有芹菜籽。一些必不可少的灵魂食物包括羽衣甘蓝、南炸鲶鱼、红豆饭。奶油饼干还有奶酪通心粉。灵魂食物有各种各样的菜肴，但是玉米面还有猪肉是灵魂食物烹饪的2个基本元素，因为它们是在奴隶制度时期提供给被奴役人口的有限食物之一。玉米面是制作炸玉米团、南方玉米面包还有炸鱼的重要成分。同时，猪肉的各个部位在灵魂食物中也占据重要的地位，通常是一些白人不吃的部位，各种不好处理的肉以及各种内脏，比如猪的肠子呀、猪脚呀什么的。在今天呢，无数的灵魂食物餐厅里，厨师们重新的创造还有改编传统的灵魂食物菜肴。这些菜肴呢，是在物质匮乏的环境中发展起来的，以供现代的食客享用。比如说，许多信仰伊斯兰教还有犹太教的黑人人士已经调整了传统的灵魂食物食谱，他们去掉了猪肉，以符合他们的宗教信仰。虽然灵魂食物这种称呼直到1960年代才在主流中出现，但许多灵魂食物菜肴起源于美国内战前的奴隶制时代，主要分布在乔治亚、阿拉巴马还有密西西比等州。就像我刚才提到的，在那个时期，他们就是被奴役的人们只能从奴隶主那里得到有限的口粮，就是包括玉米面还有猪肉，所以呢，他们不得不围绕现有的食物发展出一种独特的烹饪风格。在解放不久以后呢，许多曾经被奴役的人在大迁徙时期离开了南方，将这种烹饪风格重新的创造还有发展到了美国各地。灵魂食物这个词首次被真正的使用可以追随到1964年，当时呢，黑人自豪的概念兴起，鼓励庆祝黑人文化还有遗产，与民权运动同时进行。在20世纪50年代，一些起源于南方农村的福音还有爵士音乐的分支在全国范围内走红。当时呢，他们被更广泛的称呼为灵魂音乐。灵魂这个单词呢，成为一种流行的形容词，用来描述美国黑人文化的许多方面，包括非裔美国烹饪。那么灵魂食物作为美国的一大菜系都有哪些代表菜？先来讲讲主菜。首先不得不提到的灵魂食物代表主菜必然是炸鸡。 典型的美国南方炸鸡，外皮酥脆，内里鲜美多汁。在炸制之前用盐、大蒜、洋葱、辣椒、黑胡椒等腌制，然后呢再裹上混有香料粉的面粉之后下油锅炸制。另外一些比较常见的炸物有炸鲶鱼、炸秋葵、炸洋葱、炸番茄，然后它们的制作过程呢跟炸鸡非常的相似。其次呢是美国南方各州的 barbecue 与其他州的 barbecue 大量使用的牛肉不一样，南方各州的 barbecue 更偏爱猪肉，通常佐以甜番茄酱，存在几个区域差异。阿拉巴马州还以其独特的白酱而闻名，一种源自于阿拉巴马州北部以蛋黄酱还有醋为基础的酱汁，主要用于鸡肉还有猪肉。在北卡罗来纳州和孟菲斯，一种流行的食物是夹在面包上的手撕猪肉三明治，里面通常会放凉拌卷心菜。手撕猪肉就是将猪肩肉烧烤后切碎或者是用手撕碎制成的，配上各种配菜，比如沙拉、玉米面包、奶酪、通心粉等一起食用。下面呢，咱们要讲的是配菜、主食还有甜品。灵魂食物中最出名的配菜要数羽衣甘蓝，它们通常与其他类似的绿叶蔬菜一起烹制，比如菠菜、萝卜、青菜还有芥菜，称为混合蔬菜，也可以使用烟熏肉还有咸肉，比如像火腿、烟熏火鸡腿、猪颈骨或者是肥肉，然后再拿洋葱丁、醋、盐还有黑胡椒、白胡椒粉或碾碎的红辣椒粉还有少量的糖一起炖。羽衣甘蓝呢，不单纯是一种菜，它象征着南方文化还有非裔美国人的文化还有身份。爵士乐作曲家还有钢琴家塞隆尼斯·蒙克在他的翻领上装饰着一片羽衣甘蓝，以代表他的非裔美国人传统。在巴拉克·奥巴马总统的第一次国宴上，羽衣甘蓝也被列入菜单里。主食方面最出名的呢是玉米面包，据传最早的版本来自美国原住民。现在通常的做法呢是在烤箱中用重型铸铁煎锅加热培根油、猪油或者是其他的油，然后呢把由玉米面、鸡蛋还有牛奶制成的面糊直接倒到热油纸里面。甜品方面最有名的是红薯派还有桃子馅饼。红薯派是在没有顶皮的开放式馅饼壳中填充由红薯泥、蛋奶、糖等香料还有鸡蛋组成的馅料而制成的。至于桃子馅饼，玩过《荒野大镖客2》的吃货们可能在游戏里有注意到，在黑水镇的酒馆里有卖桃子馅饼配奶油。如果感觉飞到美国太麻烦了，也可以去游戏里品尝一下。好，今天我就给大家介绍到这里，希望大家喜欢今天的节目。各位有没有吃过灵魂食物，或者是自己有做过呢？可以在评论区告诉我。如果您喜欢本期节目的话，请记得点赞订阅我们的频道。这里是沙伦一报，我是沙伦，希望你有一个愉快的周日或者是周一。我们下期节目再会。
The biggest obstacle to American understanding of China appears to be Washington's seeming determination to misunderstand China rather than grant any credibility and legitimacy to its strategic outlook and goals. China's international behavior appears to be getting increasingly bold, more assertive, and coercive. Beijing's diplomatic efforts to claim a global leadership role are accelerating as Chinese Communist Party (CCP) leader Xi Jinping promulgates his signature Global Security Initiative and his pursuit of the reform of global governance toward the goal of a community of common destiny for mankind. With a particular focus on the Global South, Xi Jinping recently hosted the Third Belt and Road Forum and is centrally involved in expanding the BRICS group. All these projects are clearly aimed at boosting Beijing's international clout relative to Washington's. Meanwhile, China's economic diplomacy and questionable trade practices continue to be aimed at maximizing Beijing's global economic footprint and leverage relative to the United States. Its overseas influence and intelligence operations, both covert and overt, appear increasingly pervasive and, in some cases, increasingly malign. And China's military behavior in the South China Sea and on the Taiwan Strait is getting more belligerent. Echoing earlier Biden administration policy documents, the U.S. Defense Department's annual report on military and security developments involving the People's Republic of China, released in mid-October, assesses that Beijing's overall objective is to revise the international order in support of the PRC's system of governance and national interests. To that end, Beijing's strategy entails deliberate and determined efforts to amass, improve, and harness the internal and external elements of national power that will give China a leading position in the enduring competition between the ideological systems of the PRC and the United States. The prevailing American view is that these Chinese objectives and ambitions are driven by the authoritarian nature of the CCP political system and by Xi Jinping's personal leadership in particular. There is truth in this, but it overlooks, and in some respects denies, the reactive component of Chinese international behavior, the extent to which it is a response to external variables and the strategic environment as Beijing sees it. Indeed, it is essential to examine the extent to which Chinese leaders feel the need to push back against what they view as foreign challenges to or disdain for China's interests and security. This is not to suggest that Beijing's characterization of China's interests and security is wholly valid or should be taken at face value. CCP leaders routinely blur the distinction between the regime's interests and the nation's, and they exaggerate the threats to the security of both in order to rationalize objectionable domestic and foreign policies. At the same time, China does have legitimate interests and security concerns that it perceives as being challenged or disregarded by other countries. Indeed, foreign governments themselves sometimes blur the distinction between China and the CCP regime, potentially alienating the former in their efforts to avoid conceding anything to the latter. U.S. officials often distinguish between their problems with the CCP and their support for the Chinese people, but usually with an eye to the Chinese people's presumed democratic aspirations and little reflection on their external national ambitions. For example, Chinese foreign policy often invokes the need to rectify the century of humiliation, the period from the Opium War of the 1840s through World War II in the 1940s, during which China was attacked, colonized, and exploited by foreign powers. This is cited to defend China's sovereignty claims and pursuit of great power status. Because much of this narrative has been exaggerated and propagandized by the CCP, U.S. officials often dismiss its validity and contemporary relevance. But the century of humiliation is not merely a CCP slogan. It evokes real historical experiences that remain a visceral source of genuine Chinese nationalism, even among anti-communists, and affects how Chinese people view their country's rightful place in the world. From Beijing's perspective, it often appears as if Washington is unwilling to publicly acknowledge that China has any legitimate concerns or national interests. Indeed, one is hard-pressed to find official U.S. statements that do so because the political environment in Washington, in which the Republicans and Democrats are competing to be toughest on Beijing, seems to prescribe conceding the validity of any aspect of the Chinese point of view. It also seems to prescribe acknowledging that Chinese behavior might in any way be reactive to U.S. policies and actions. Instead, U.S.-China tensions are attributed almost exclusively to the nature of the CCP, the unreasonableness of its international behavior, and its expansive strategic ambitions. Beijing also perceives that its positions on international issues, unless they support U.S. policies, are similarly dismissed as duplicitous, disingenuous, or self-serving. This has been reflected in China's approach to the war in Ukraine, where Beijing has asserted that Russia has legitimate security interests that were compromised by NATO expansion, and its approach to the Israel-Gaza war, where it has sought to promote the legitimate security interests of the Palestinians. Although Beijing maintains these views for genuine strategic reasons, in both cases, the Chinese position has been largely rebuffed in Washington as implicitly supporting aggression and inadequate to advancing peace. On territorial and sovereignty issues, Beijing also sees Washington as generally dismissive of assertions that China's aggressive behavior is in any measure a reaction to steps taken by other countries. In the South China Sea, there is a long and complex history to the interactive dynamic that has fueled regional tensions, but Beijing garners no empathy for its view that other countries have also assertively pushed the envelope in pursuit of their sovereignty claims. This is especially evident with regard to Taiwan. There is virtually no public acknowledgement in Washington that Beijing's escalatory behavior on the Taiwan Strait might be a response to policies and statements emanating from Taipei and Washington, which have eroded the one China understandings that largely maintained stability for 4 decades. Instead, the rising cross-strait tensions are attributed almost exclusively to Chinese impatience and internally driven aggression. Beijing also sees Washington as largely disregarding Chinese assessments of the strategic environment, especially when they incorporate judgments about U.S. intentions. The new 2023 DoD report on China states that PRC leaders view the United States as deploying a whole-of-government effort meant to contain the PRC's rise. This correctly summarizes Beijing's view, but it overlooks the fact that the U.S. government is expressly engaged in a whole-of-government effort to counter, constrain, and compete against China. Many U.S. politicians have even explicitly referred to this strategy as containment. Similarly, the DoD report states that PRC leaders have characterized China's view of strategic competition in terms of a rivalry among powerful nation-states, as well as a clash of opposing ideological systems. This, too, is correct, but it overlooks the fact that the Biden administration itself routinely talks about strategic competition with China in terms of a rivalry between great powers and a clash between ideological systems. It thus should not be surprising if Beijing views Washington's own rhetoric as disingenuous and self-serving. Nor should it be surprising, given all these indicators of Washington's apparent disregard for the Chinese perspective, that Chinese leaders are inclined to discount U.S. concerns in a similar fashion. More importantly, they are also inclined and even motivated to double down with their own competitive whole-of-government approach to confronting the challenge they perceive from the United States. In short, Beijing's increasingly active pursuit of global influence relative to and at the expense of Washington is a predictable response to its failure to make headway in getting U.S. acknowledgement of and attention to Chinese interests and security concerns. Indeed, Beijing has arguably grown more ambitious, arrogant, and provocative in its international behavior because of its frustration with the lack of substantive progress in engagement with Washington. From the Chinese perspective, the U.S. side has made the strategic competition a zero-sum game. Beijing will act accordingly by using its levers of power and influence to bolster China's position and effect changes in global governance that are more conducive to Chinese interests and strategic objectives. This is central to the reactive component of China's international behavior, which is no less a driver of that behavior than the nature of the CCP regime or Xi Jinping's personal ambitions. Would the United States, or any other confident and powerful nation, react differently to circumstances in which its interests, security, and strategic perspective appear to be largely rejected or deemed illegitimate by a strategic rival? How do we expect Beijing to act in such circumstances? For example, how do we expect Beijing to act with regard to the Taiwan issue? By admitting the error of its ways, its exclusive responsibility for cross-strait tensions, and its relative vulnerability in a potential conflict scenario, thus abandoning its pursuit of unification with Taiwan? That is not going to happen because Beijing's commitment to its position on Taiwan is visceral, and its calculus of its relative leverage is strong and may be getting stronger. Nor will Beijing retreat from its strategic calculus or principles about Ukraine, Gaza, the South China Sea, global governance, or a range of other international issues because Washington believes it has the balance of leverage and the moral high ground. Again, none of this is meant to suggest that Beijing's strategic ambitions and behavior are benign or that Washington should acquiesce to them. China seeks to maximize its global power, influence, legitimacy, and security relative to and at the expense of the United States. And it does seek revisions to the international system that facilitate and advance that goal. But that goal is partly a product of Beijing's assessment that Washington is determined to minimize China's power, influence, and legitimacy and thus its security, and is unwilling to accept the validity of China's external interests or pursuit of a global leadership role. This is the zero-sum contest that Beijing believes Washington has imposed upon China, even though Washington appears to judge that Beijing is responsible for making it zero-sum. Does the United States really fear that China will succeed in supplanting it as the global hegemon by winning the hearts and minds of much of the rest of the world and imposing on it the CCP system of governance and development? That overestimates Beijing's strategic intentions, underestimates the agency of other countries, and reflects a striking lack of confidence in the global appeal and legitimacy of democracy and capitalism. In any event, the international system is reshaping itself in the wake of historic shifts in the distribution of wealth, power, and influence, not because China has launched an effort to reshape it. Beijing, nonetheless, is taking advantage of the opportunity to drive the process to its benefit, while Washington appears instead to be resisting or denying the historical trend. The United States should be competing with Beijing to capitalize on it, with confidence in the assets and strengths it brings to the process. China's competitive moves against the United States and its efforts to cultivate support from other countries are partly driven by Beijing's judgment that this probably will be more productive than seeking U.S. acknowledgement of and attention to its views through reciprocal engagement. Chinese leaders will not abandon the latter in their bilateral interactions with Washington, but they feel the need to maneuver for advantage both multilaterally and globally. They recognize that the United States has prioritized strategic competition with China over cooperation and engagement, so they are accelerating their plans to meet that competition. In short, Beijing will step up its efforts to score points against Washington because it judges that it is not scoring points with Washington and sees diminishing prospects for doing so. Antagonism and the lack of strategic empathy on both sides are thus preventing Washington and Beijing from recognizing and genuinely responding to each other's perspectives. Beijing, arguably the petitioner in the bilateral relationship because of China's relative disadvantages, routinely invokes the need for diplomacy aimed at pursuing mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. Washington, openly confident of its relative strengths and openly critical of what it claims are Beijing's true strategic intentions, generally dismisses this as CCP propaganda. In contrast, the U.S. side routinely describes U.S.-China diplomatic interaction as aimed minimally at responsibly managing the competition and maintaining open channels of communication, as Biden reportedly expressed personally to Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in late October. This suggests a U.S. lack of interest in aiming higher or perhaps a lack of readiness to assume the necessary requirements and responsibilities of doing so. The biggest obstacle to American understanding of China thus appears to be Washington's seeming determination to misunderstand China rather than grant any credibility and legitimacy to its strategic outlook and goals. This only reinforces Beijing's adversarial response. Washington will not be able to work constructively with Beijing toward overcoming bilateral mistrust and sharing global leadership, which ultimately will be necessary until it is prepared to consider the Chinese point of view and recognize that the long-term risks of misunderstanding and antagonizing Beijing are greater than the risks of taking into account China's strategic interests and concerns.
U.S.-China relations is a deeply, deeply personal topic for me. My mother is from China, and my father is American. And so U.S.-China relations is literally a dinner table conversation every day. So we kind of need to get along. So that's kind of the back, if you will. We are in a very serious situation right now. And thank you all for coming and sort of joining the discussion, because this is such a serious topic. And what I want to do is start the discussion by going back in history. There's just been enormous change in the world and in China and in the U.S. in the last 40 years since the United States and China normalized relations in 1979, before which was a period of extreme isolation between U.S. and China. And what I would like to do is just start with a quote from Richard Nixon. And I'm going to read the whole thing because I think it's very eloquently written, and I'm sure this is familiar with all of you, but Richard Nixon, before going to China and actually before becoming elected president, he said, taking the long view, we simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations, there to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hates, and threaten its neighbors. There is no place on this small planet for 1 billion of its potentially most able people to live in angry isolation. Thanks to President Nixon and to President Carter, and thanks to Mao and Deng, they were able to achieve a path to peace. And indeed, I think his words were prescient, that the potential of the Chinese people, that once we had that relationship, both nations have flourished as a result of that relationship. So the question is, are we headed back to a period of angry isolation again? And what can we do to head that off and to prevent it? The sad situation now is in Washington, D.C., we have people who view China as an existential threat to the West writ large. And in Beijing, we have people who view that believe that the United States that the main goal of America is actually to contain China, not just in a military sense on issues like Taiwan and the South China Sea, but that the US wants to literally isolate China politically, technologically, and economically. There's a Chinese expression that says, if there's 2 tigers on a mountain, then what do you do? And so that view, if we literally are in a situation where we are 2 tigers on a mountain, this inevitably leads to war. That is the goal that we are trying to avoid. So let me just talk about 2 specific flashpoints where we're at. I mean, obviously Taiwan is a situation where China claims the island as its own territory. The United States, on the other hand, is kind of backed into a corner. We have defense responsibility. If the United States does not come to the aid of Taiwan, then a whole series of interlocking security alliances, Japan, South Korea, and others, unravel. So this is one of the things that put us in this bind. South China Sea, same basic situation. You've got a situation where China is claiming the entire area as its own territory, other countries conflicting claims, but more to the point, the US military is operating in the entire South China Sea as if it's international waters. Are we still on? Yeah. The American military is operating in international waters. Here's the problem, is whether those islands, whether the South China Sea belongs to China or not, China is a trading nation. It fundamentally depends on access to the oceans for its existence. It imports oil, food, minerals, all those things. So you've got a situation there where you've got these 2 flashpoints where the 2 sides just don't agree. And now what we've got is literally the 2 largest navies on Earth are operating in the same waters with literally no agreement about what are the rules for operations. They don't even agree on what the territorial boundaries are. So I don't want to terrify people, but to get your attention, we've got a situation where we've got military ships operating in close proximity with each other that are coming within 150 feet of each other. These are Navy destroyers on both sides that are maneuvering in close proximity with each other. 150 feet, that is the distance from here to there. It's the distance of a swimming pool. That's how big it is. And we've got airplanes that are coming to within 10 feet of each other. So this is a situation that, this is what brings us here today to talk about what we can do about these kinds of things. The conversation, obviously, highly relevant right now, because we're just about to start the APEC, where we have the heads of state of 21 nations. I promise you, all of those nations are focused on this issue as well. Because if a conflict actually happens between the United States and China, all of those countries are deeply affected. They all have huge trade relationships with both the United States and China. So we have an expert panel here to talk through the issues. It's a diverse group with different perspectives. We're very fortunate to have all four of them. They've all got their books available. What I want to do is introduce each of them in turn and ask them to make some initial remarks just around the general topic of peace. What are we fighting about? What are the prospects? What's the journey forward? What kinds of things can be done that would lead us to a peaceful coexistence between the United States and China? So that's what I'd like you to address first, and then I'll come back and ask you a follow-up question. We have people that we have some local people, but we also have two that have come from afar. Thank you, Andy. Your turn will come. But Zoe Liu actually came from the furthest away. She came from New York, and so I'm going to give her the honor of going first. I'll just say, Zoe. Zoe is a doctor, is a fellow for China Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. She has two books out. She's the author of a book called "Can BRICS De-Dollarize the Global Financial System?" And that's actually a topic that's highly relevant to our conversation. This is still kind of fading in and out. And a second book called "Sovereign Funds: How the Communist Party of China Finances Its Global Ambitions." Zoe was actually born in China, but she lives in New York. And this topic is, just on a personal note, I think this topic is highly relevant. Her grandfather actually fought in not one, not two, but 3 wars. And so again, that is the outcome we're trying to avoid here. So Zoe, why don't you get us started and give us your thoughts on the overall topic?
Yeah, sure, Carl. Thank you very much for your kind and personal introduction. And I also want to thank everybody here today to share your time with us on this issue that at least I hope that, the issue that we are interested in is also something that you are also interested in, so that we don't waste your time. And I also want to thank Sean and Bill for having me here, because, when I sit on the chair and came into the hall, I realized my mom would not want me to touch the furniture because these are museum pieces. And finally, I also wanted to say that I'm actually a student and learned a lot from the panels here, from Professor Victor Shi, from Andy, from Orwell, and these are, when you look at me, you realize, oh, okay, so she is somebody who has learned and benefited from a lot of the existing knowledge that have been created by a lot of the other people here. And in terms, it goes back to Sean, it goes back to Carl's question, what are we fighting about? I think the fundamental, I'm a economic finance person, and I can say that, well, there are, the United States has never been happy about trade deficit with China, and the United States has never been happy with China's market access. And, if you talk to people in the Treasury, they would also explain to you that in the United States, we have this process called CFIUS, and it's a panel across different government organizations, and their job is to examine the national security risks of Chinese investment in the United States. And then if you talk to some media person or people in Washington these days, people are going to say, well, we do have this new thing called Executive Order on Outbound Investment. The idea is American capital is enabling Chinese in particular, to enable the military capabilities in China. So we have to do something about it. So, I can give you so many different things that simply US and China simply do not see eye to eye to each other. And to just put a final note on this, on this, the Biden administration have been communicating this idea of small yard, high fence. The idea is, there are these 3 particularly sensitive areas, semiconductor, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. These are the areas we are really concerned, and we do not want our technology to somehow enable or facilitate the technological advancement of the PLA, which end up hurting America's national security. And guess what? From China's perspective, you talk to any Chinese people, not just national security folks or hardcore, Communist Party supporters. You just talk with common people, even on the street. I was in China in this April, and I literally asked people about this. And, I was not surprised to hear Chinese people, both my friends as well as some just cab drivers, they interpret that as America trying to contain China. Now, this brings me to a little bit of, I wanted to put a little bit of a historical perspective here. At least China is not unfamiliar with containment. If you think about it, when the PRC was established back in 1949, the country was established as a rebellion against the American-led Yatta system. It was established under extreme isolation. And during that period of time, actually, history rhymed in this particular case very well. In the 60s and the 70s, China detonated its own atomic bomb and hydrogen bomb. And now what we are trying to do here, we're trying to stop the idea of through export control, through investment screening, trying to slow down China's technological development. Now, I think the net effect of that would actually be increase or raise the cost of President Xi Jinping's commitment to achieve self-sufficiency, but to what extent it can achieve the effect of stop China's technological advancement. I'm pessimistic about achieving that goal, specifically because technology has in its nature diffusion, and because of all this back and forth, who actually get into this crossfire is people, is all these Chinese students, is the researchers. It's a startup company here in Silicon Valley. Perhaps one of the founders is Chinese. And then when you started to raise capital, now because of this investment screening, outbound investment screening, people start to ask the question. Instead of asking the question, are you Chinese and are you trying to finance the PLA? Now the question becomes, wait, are you Chinese? And I think that is a dangerous trend. And that's why I think here at iHouse, we have people here actually care about the trajectory, managing the risk, is something very promising.
Good. Thank you, Zoe, for your thoughts. Good. We'll come back to some of those topics in a minute. Let's bring Andy Rothman into the conversation. Andy, have known each other for many years. He lived in Shanghai. Andy is an investment strategist at Matthews Asia, but he also spent 2 decades, I think, as a American diplomat, both posted both in Guangzhou and then with the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. So very glad to have you here, Andy, for your thoughts.
Thanks, Kerr, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to all of you today. And I appreciate the great turnout to talk about this issue, which I think is really important. I'm going to break this down into 3 elements to address the question of basically, do we really need to find a way to get along with China? Because it amazes me that when I go to the East Coast, I often find people who tell me that we don't. So I'll break it down into 3 components. The first is the most important one for me, which is just at a personal level. Chinese people are actually, in my experience of living in China for more than 20 years, pretty much the same as us. That probably doesn't strike you as weird, but I know a lot of people who have trouble believing that. And not only are they the same as us, but I think that if you look at the fundamental question which a lot of people in the US are debating right now, which is engagement, which has become kind of a dirty word in Washington now, between the US and China, is that good for us? I think one of the ways to answer that question is to look at how engagement since 1979 has affected the average Chinese person, not people in the government. When I first went to China as a student in 1980, and this is, we were talking earlier, I'm worried that this kind of opportunity that I had might not be available anymore. I didn't have any interest when I was an undergraduate in New York in China, but I had an economics professor who happened to be from China. And when the US and China reestablished diplomatic relations, he got a grant to take about a dozen students to China for a month. We basically traveled around and met his old classmates. And that just got me hooked. Maybe because that was my first trip out of North America. If I'd gone to Brazil, I probably would have done Brazil for the next 40 years. You know, because when I got this opportunity, I called my parents and told them I was going to do this. And my mother said, "You don't even like Chinese food." I can tell you Chinese food in New York back then was, anyway, it was eye-opening that China had just come out of the Cultural Revolution. Mao had just died a few years ago. The place was a disaster, but the people were amazing and really the same. But it was so backward. I went back to work there 4 years later with the State Department as a diplomat, very junior diplomat. And we lived and had our office in an old Soviet-built hotel, the Dongfang Bingguan. And we had a little hotel room that looked out into a courtyard. And in the middle of the courtyard was an escalator. It was only one track of an escalator. It just went up. And when you got up to the top, you just had to walk down a flight of stairs because there was nothing up there. But on the weekend, they opened it up, and people would be lined up for miles to ride the escalator. This was 1984. I'm telling this story just to illustrate how China, in a relatively short period of time, has gone from an incredibly poor place. Per capita income since that time to now has increased 148 times. Here, during that same period of time, our income has increased 5 times. Now, obviously, we started at a higher position. Engagement has been so good for the average Chinese person that we should be really happy about that. That is a major success for everyone on the planet from a personal perspective. Then the second perspective is economics. Our lives would be completely different today if China had not grown up like that. I mean, think about the technology that runs our life today, or that we use to run our own life today, depending on how you look at it. It would be impossible. I mean, iPhones would probably not exist if it wasn't for highly skilled but low-wage manufacturing and supply chains in China. All the jobs that go along with that, designing it, selling it, servicing it, because as I'm sure you guys know, the vast majority of the profits from the sale of an iPhone don't go to China where they make it. It goes to people here who design and sell and service it. Our life would be completely different. If we cut off these supply chains, our cost of living would skyrocket. Our access to medicine would plummet. If you talk to Dr. Bob Lee, who works with us at the Asia Society, he'll tell you that collaboration with scientists and pharmaceutical companies in China reduces by 7 years the amount of time it takes to get new cancer drugs to market for us. So from a commercial, economic perspective, it's highly integrated and really important to our life. The third perspective, this is the realm of the idiots. It's politics. Because if you think about those first two perspectives, who doesn't want this to work? Now, granted, there are challenges. We have a mature, possibly declining superpower here. We're being pushed by a rising superpower. And it's up to our politicians now, including the diplomats that I used to work with, to figure out a way to make this work. And it's not easy. But given the first two things I highlighted, it just amazes me that we have people in Washington who are saying, you know, we just need to determine that China's the enemy and treat them that way. And there's no hope of engagement actually working like it has the last few years because of Xi Jinping, let's say, because he's there now. Well, you know, we've had obstacles before, not just with China, but with other countries. We can't let that, in my view, distract us from this. And the last point I'll make is no one has yet persuaded me in Washington who says China wants to tear down or destroy the international order that the US and the UK built on the rubble of World War II. China got rich and powerful, and the Communist Party is still in power by playing in the rules that we created. Now, are they now trying to shift the rules to be more advantageous to China? For sure. You would expect them to do that. That's why we need to be integrated in those organizations. We need to be participating in them, whether it's the UN or the WTO or the TPP, to push back and not give up and say, let's just slug it out. I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Andy. Thanks, Andy. We'll come back to some of those themes. I mean, to your point about the people-to-people exchange, which I think is really a key point here. One of those things that's actually been missing is through COVID, we've really lost that people-to-people exchange. And I think I couldn't agree with you more, in terms of how similar Chinese people are, but much more similar than we are different, put it that way. And I think there's been a lot of discussion at that level about this whole idea of capitalism versus communism. And you go there in the street in Shanghai and...
Can I just add that, I moved from Shanghai to Berkeley about 10 years ago, and...
The People's Republic of Berkeley you're talking about?
Well, tell me if this makes sense to you guys, but I often tell people that I believe there are more folks who believe in Marxist-Leninism in my neighborhood than there are in Beijing.
Fair enough. Let's bring Victor into the conversation, and also let's bring all of you into the conversation. You should have picked up some cards on the way in, and if you could start, as we have this conversation, if you can think of questions or topics that you would like to suggest, please go ahead and do that, and magically somebody will bring them up, and we can get to those. Victor Scher is the director of the 21st Century Center on China, actually newly appointed director, so congratulations there, I think, over the summer. He's the author of 2 books. One is titled The Factions and Finance in China, Elite Conflict and Inflation, and then the second book, Coalitions of the Weak. So those sound very interesting, but the most important point, a lot of us look at Victor for sort of insight on elite politics, meaning kind of who's driving the bus over there. So we often tap Victor for insight on various different things that are happening at the Central Committee, Politburo. We sometimes call him the horse whisperer. He somehow he knows things that other people don't. But Victor, share with us your thoughts, if you would.
Well, I mean, if that's the only thing I knew, I'd be out of a job, because I think all of us here knows who's driving the bus in China. It's Comrade Xi Jinping. Anyway, so on the topic of today, I think the problem in both the U.S. and in China, but of course, it's always more serious in the U.S. just because political dialogue is all out in the open here. And then you have the 2 parties, and of course, they're trying to score points off of each other. And China happens to be like a central issue where they're trying to score points of each other. So this kind of framing of China as the enemy, existential threat, as Kurz, you pointed out, extremely unhelpful, because when you have the 2 largest economies of the world dealing with each other, it's going to be multidimensional. It's going to be very complex. So what I like to do is to break it down, along sort of different issue areas. And the way that I see it is there are some issue areas where there is a genuine sort of competition between the U.S. and China. And, both sides sort of engage in it out of their perceived notion of sort of self-interest in security. Then there are areas where, especially the U.S., again, because we get very political publicly, will hype up the so-called China threat, and it's not very helpful, And if you look at these issues, these so-called threat issues of China, it's just there's nothing to it, or not very much to these issues. And then finally, there are areas where the U.S. and China really need to cooperate, like climate. Especially like public health, global public health, the 2 largest economies of the world need to cooperate on these issues, or nothing much is going to work that well. So on the first part, the issues of genuine competition, if you look at the military, and I'm not a military expert by any means, but if you look at the Pacific, it is getting to be a very crowded place because you have the traditional, of course, the U.S. Navy, very powerful, engaged in, imperialism, basically, in previous decades. But now the largest Navy in the Pacific is no longer the United States. It's actually China. So if you look at surface vessels, primarily operating in the Pacific is not the U.S. Navy. The U.S. still has the largest Navy in the world, but that's because the U.S. has a global Navy. But if you look at just the Pacific, the Chinese Navy now has more tonnage, larger number of destroyers than the U.S. By a large margin, actually, I think. So it's getting very crowded. So I think I agree with Kurs that for that, of course, the two sides are building up capabilities for whatever crazy reasons that they're doing it. But what's really important to keep things sort of manageable is to have protocols where the frontline commanders of the two navies can communicate with each other directly in case there are, incidents like accidental clashes or, close proximities, etc. I think that is extremely important. On the core technology like telecom infrastructure, again, the two sides have sort of closed each other off of each other. But, of course, China did this, a lot of it, and then the U.S. reciprocated. There are good reasons to do that, and the two sides are doing it. I think in general, sort of humanity does not suffer that much. If the U.S. doesn't use Huawei or the Chinese government doesn't allow, Cisco into the Chinese market, it's unfortunate, but it's not the worst thing in the world. So then there are some issues where U.S. politicians have really played up and say, oh, this is, a symptom of the China threat. The renminbi is going to eclipse the U.S. dollar. So Zoe is the expert here. We know that's not going to happen, because China has this thing called capital control, where they literally don't allow the renminbi to leave the country. So if they do that, how is it possible for the renminbi to replace the dollar? It literally is not possible. So I don't know why people keep on playing it. I was like, oh, this is going to happen next year. And look at all this stuff they're doing. They're training with the Russians and renminbi and all this stuff. Well, go ahead. I mean, Sino-Russian trade is tiny, a fraction of global trade. They can invoice that in renminbi. They can invoice it with Kazakhstan. How big is Kazakhstan? The Berkeley economy is bigger than the economy of Kazakhstan. Go ahead and trade in renminbi. Has no impact. The other thing is the debt trap diplomacy, which is, I have to say, is the current manifestation of a very sort of imperialist attitude that developing countries cannot make their own decisions, right? No one pointed a gun at these countries to take on Chinese debt. They did so willingly. Some of them indeed cannot repay the Chinese government, but actually that's not a problem for the United States or anyone. It's a problem for China. China got into this credit arrangement with developing countries. The developing countries took on the debt willingly, and now some of them cannot repay. How is that a threatening thing to the United States? I don't understand this line of argument, and whoever made it up, I don't know, brilliant or stupid, or I don't really understand. So finally, more optimistically, I think on climate change. So here's the statistics. The cost of solar power declined by 90% in the 10 years prior to 2018. So from 2008 to 2018, dropped by 9%. A little bit of that is from cost efficiency from installation. So that's mainly on the US side, or whoever's installing the solar power. But the vast majority of the cost decrease is because Chinese companies can make solar panels very, very cheaply. Part of that indeed is because of Chinese government subsidies. But think about it. So this is what happened. The Chinese taxpayers who paid taxes to the Chinese government, then the Chinese government uses taxes and also some credit from Chinese banking system, which is savings of the Chinese people, to subsidize solar panel companies in China so that they can sell these panels very cheaply to the rest of the world, so that emission can decrease in the rest of the world, how's that a bad thing, right? You know, I think it's unfortunate for Chinese taxpayers that they have to pay for a global public goods, but for the rest of the world, it's great. You know, it's like, I'm sorry, you know, Chinese taxpayers, you don't make that much money, and you're helping us save the world. We should be celebrating it instead of saying, oh, wow, this is very questionable. You know, we don't know if this is okay and all that kind of stuff. So I find that very silly. Finally, in global public health, COVID, other diseases. I mean, unfortunately for COVID, I think China did not do such a good job sharing data with the rest of the world. But that's an area that needs global cooperation, because there will be more COVIDs down the pipeline, and it will take the might of the two largest industrial economies in the world, the two countries with the brightest scientific minds, among others, to really figure out the future public health challenges that will hit the world. I'll stop here.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you do. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Victor. I mean, this was so frustrating to us, the business community in Shanghai. I was living in Shanghai when COVID broke out, and you know, everybody had been talking about climate change in areas where the U.S. and China could and should cooperate, and climate change was so obvious. How about a global pandemic? You know, and it was so frustrating to see how quickly cooperation turned to outright animosity between the two nations, where, as Victor pointed out correctly, you know, that there was the data sharing issues, but then on the other side, then there became the name calling issues, you know, from the U.S. side, yeah. And it was just agony to be in China to watch that whole thing unfold. So good. We'll come back to a couple of topics that you brought up, Victor. Appreciate it. Our very own Orville Schell, local, former professor and dean of the School of Journalism here at Berkeley, and you know, very much an expert on this topic, author of 15 books, 16 counting. How he does that, I don't know. I do want to point, and at this point, director of the China Center at the Asia Society based in New York, kind of splits his time between West Coast and East Coast. But I also personally, I want to endorse one of his books that probably doesn't get as, or isn't in the same category as the others, because it's actually fiction. So the 15 books I mentioned were all nonfiction, and he wrote a novel called Coming Home, My Old Home. An incredible book written. It's about the experience of the Cultural Revolution right through June 4th, '89, and it's a book that if you pick it up, it's a great way to really get a visceral feeling for what that must have been like to go through the Cultural Revolution, and then one of the really interesting things in the book was when the switch flipped, when all of a sudden Mao and Nixon woke up in the morning and they're friends, you know, and everybody was told that, oh, everything that we told you about America being Satan, oh, it's the opposite now. America's our friend, and I thought that was fascinating how you dealt with that within in the format of a novel. So I highly recommend that book as well as the others. Orville, if you would share with us your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Kurt. Well, here we are. President Biden is about to meet with Party General Secretary Xi right here in San Francisco. And I think there's a bit of a ghost of the past hanging over this meeting in terms of expectation. And that is that we look back to this period that all of you have alluded to of engagement. And as Andy suggested, why did it end? It was demonstrably in the interest of China, worked very well for the United States. And I think I want to just spend a few little minutes here to kind of think through with you what was engagement about, why did it end, and could it come back, or what form of getting together could come back? So first let me say, you know, there's this expression in Chinese of sleeping in the same bed but dreaming different dreams. You know, 同床异梦. And I think there was a bit of that during our long and very sort of optimistic period that was underlaid by engagement. What I mean to say is this, that from the American perspective, engagement was this kind of big, woolly, idealistic American ideal. Just let's trade, let's send ballet troops, academic exchanges. We'll just kind of get to know each other, get to like each other, and the rough edges will wear off, and somehow we'll migrate to a different state of grace. It was rather naive, but hopeful. And I think bespoke of America's fundamental idealism and evangelical sense that if we could just get it right, we could change the world. Now, if we turn to the Chinese side, I think, you know, what is so interesting is there's no word in Chinese. There's a word for engagement, but it isn't like a branded name. The way it is here, where we think, oh, engagement, it means this, it's a whole policy. No, the word in Chinese, 接触, means just kind of connect. But no one spoke about it as the great halcyon period of the great breakthrough period. And in fact, if you sort of drill into the process of engagement during the 80s and 90s, and remember, it continued even after 1989 and the Beijing massacre. What you find is a kind of a transactional nature of the Chinese involvement. That we could use some Western technology. We could use a little Western marketization. We could use a lot of things as we come out of the Cultural Revolution. But don't forget that in 1981, just as the reform movement was exploding and this extraordinary decade of the 80s was starting in China, Deng Xiaoping announced what he called the 4 basic principles. Now, most people were just bored to death by these kinds of 4 thises, the 3 that's, and the, you know, how that slogans go in China. But they meant something, and that was, doesn't matter how much we reform and open, the Communist Party is at the center. And don't forget it. So this meant that engagement from the Chinese perspective was a rather utilitarian borrowing mechanism. It harkened back to the Qing dynasty, where they had another slogan, which was, you know, use Western things for practical use, but keep the basic Eastern things for the for the overall value system and the bigger scheme of things. And so I think there was a great ambiguity about it, engagement in the Communist Party, because they knew that if you kept engaging too much and had too much reform, they could see where it was going. And then when Gorbachev tried it and the Soviet Union collapsed, the empire crumbled, they saw it with utter clarity. And this is, I think, the sort of the seedbed out of which Xi Jinping's leadership comes. And this is what we're dealing with now, is a kind of a very circumspect attitude that reform, yes, they had a big reform movement, and engagement and all of these things is all well and good to a point. But it could lead to the end of the one-party state in China. And look at what happened in Russia. And Xi Jinping has said that. He said, you know, Soviet Union collapsed because no one was brave enough to stand up and save it. So I want to mention this only to say that it's not that I don't think engagement was a good idea, but I want to remind you all that it wasn't a treaty. We didn't all agree on the same inner mechanics of what was happening. And as Xi beats Biden, we have to ask ourselves, is this still viable? This kind of formulation? And I would say categorically, not to Xi Jinping. So what is the new formulation? How can we get along? I mean, we've all expressed a great, deep nostalgia for that era. And that is the question of questions, which we might ruminate on a bit more. I think at very least, what we should do is try to avoid conflict. But I have to say, I'm not particularly optimistic about us being able to find a new and a successful way of getting along as we had in the 80s and 90s. And the reason why I'm less than optimistic is because behind all of these efforts, all of these hopes, dreams of getting along, hugging it out, is this, they're two very different political systems. Chinese always say, well, we need greater understanding, mutual understanding. I wonder, because it seems to me that there is a possibility that the more we understand each other's system, the less we're going to like it. And that's a frightening thought. It throws a big wrench into works, any efforts to try to find a new accommodation, a new balance point where we can't get along.
Thank you, Orville. Interesting what you're saying, Orville. As you were speaking, I was thinking about some of the things that Andy had brought up, and that people to people, we're pretty much the same. But that's not the point. It's government to government, because countries' international relations doesn't actually, I mean, people to people is important, right, but diplomatic relations are gov to gov. And we do have extremely different systems. Andy, I'll give you an opportunity to react to that in a minute, but let's come back. Well, you can think about it. And we'll, let me do this. What I'm going to do, I'm going to ask Zoe a question, but I'm also going to combine it with a question that I got from the audience. It's about skilled labor. But what I'd like you to ask, Zoe, can we go deeper into the discussion about people and how people in China view this issue, view the United States? And people come in different categories. They're by age, they have different views sometimes by age, by their own personal interests, what their occupation is, also by what they are reading and listening to, what media they have access to. So people kind of, and then China has a different, whole nother set of category of people those who have traveled overseas, those who have not. And so I wonder if you could give us a little more color on that. And while you do that, I want to bring up this other question from the audience that's actually directed at Andy, but I'd like to know your views on it, Zoe. And I actually have some opinions of my own. It says, Mr. Rothman, you claimed that our American lives would be completely different without the high-skill, low-wage labor in China. I am troubled by this statement because that makes it seem as if U.S. companies and people had better lives due to exploitation of ordinary Chinese people, and what is the Chinese government has allowed that. Can you give your thoughts? So it was directed to Andy, but actually I'd be curious to know what Zoe has to say about it, and then I'll give you a chance to.
I guess when Andy said living here, he has met more people believing in Marxism and Leninism than he was in China. I get that now. So in terms of going back to the first question about people, I do, despite we are talking about U.S.-China tension and all that, and I think if I remember it correctly, back in 2017, the U.S. national security strategy identified China as a strategic competitor. And since then, the framing of U.S.-China relations has become this strategic competition, great power competition, and so on and so forth. And, my own critique of this kind of framing, similar to Professor Shi, this is actually very, very much distracting. It leads to this bipartisan consensus focusing on bashing China, and that's the only thing that we can bring both parties into a room, rather than focusing on China is not a problem that we need or we can solve, but it's actually a situation that we need to handle. And I quote Kurt Campbell. So from that perspective, I do think what our strategy has been focusing on is to protect our the downside risk with all these export controls and all these things. It's really about protecting our downside risk rather than focusing on building up our upside leverage. And building up our upside leverage. And I think that's a lot to say with the people. I consider myself as, growing up in the golden era of U.S.-China relations. I grew up, Carl mentioned that my grandpa fought 3 wars. He survived the Sino-Japanese War, fought on the communist side, and then he fought the Chinese Civil War. Obviously, he fought on the communist side. And then he fought the Americans in Korea. And somebody like him, I grew up with him as the only child growing up with him. My parents were, they were working, remote elsewhere. I grew up with my grandpa, and he literally told me that when I got a chance to go to America, I should. For somebody who fought the enemy, literally the enemy, he told me that I should go to America if I get the opportunity to study and to see America. And I find that kind of very, very, very puzzling, especially if we put it in today's context, because for somebody like me, having a grandfather who fought the Americans, growing up in an era where Deng Xiaoping tell everybody, hey guys, the main theme of the world today is peace and development. That's the era we grew up in. And if you look, I'm concerned about the kids now growing up in China, especially after 2007, 2008. The old saying of the east wind will prevail over the west wind has not only revived, but becoming stronger for those generation, for this new generation of Chinese people, right? The narrative of how much we should care about U.S.-China relations have been different. And you also end up having, especially during COVID these days, on Chinese social media, you see people starting to criticize all these Chinese elite school graduates, saying that, well, you guys are traitors because you go to America and you do not come back to China. So from that perspective, relating that to the high-skilled labor perspective, I do think China the rise of the Chinese economy benefited from its demographic premium, and in particular, is a highly trained, skilled, educated, but relatively low-cost labor, right? But that's also because, when you think about the labor in terms of like simple Econ 101, the supply and demand, if you have more supply than demand, then, the price is lower. And in the early days of reform and open up, it was like that. And on top of that, Chinese people, 1.4 billion of Chinese people, to quote President Nixon, it's most likely to be the most capable to realize their deep potential. Now you have 1.4 billion Chinese people who are not only willing to work, they are willing to work extra hours, they are willing to work several jobs. Now you realize, so it's not that, to quote Professor Xi, it's not that American imperialists is putting a gun of Chinese laborers, but actually for a long period of time, Chinese laborers prefer to work for multinationals, not only because of better pay, not only because of better training, corporate environment, but also because it's a prestige. It's a badge of honor. But I'm afraid that this trend has reversed because not just economic malaise, but also the lack of individual economic security. And people started to say, you have all you hear this in the news that very often these days, people with graduate or even PhD programs in atomic science, they ended up working for a local government, like a very low-level civil servant. So from that perspective, I really do not think the labor market dynamic is speaking well, both for U.S.-China relations or for the Chinese economy going forward. Lying flat become the prevailing sentiment. So how are you going to, if 1.4 billion Chinese people, knowing that actually by 2040, there will be more Chinese people above the years of 60, which is the legal retirement age right now, than the entire US population. By 2040, the Chinese retirement age, like about 60 and above, would be 402 million. And that year, the US population would be 390-something million. In other words, demographics does not speak well for China either. And this is exactly why we need, depending upon how we define engagement, I know I will learn every time, reading Professor Orwell's book or hearing his talk, I learn something new. And now I realize, yes, he's right. There is not necessarily a counterpart in terms of how China talks about engagement, but at least keeping people-to-people's relationship, at least restore the language exchange. How about bringing back the Fulbright exchange programs? Mm-hmm. I think these are the kind of things that people want.
Great, thanks for that, Zoe. Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Really good. No, I think you answered the question perfectly. In terms of the exploitation of labor, I would strongly agree. I've lived in China for more than 20 years. I've never heard people complain about that. They really see that as an opportunity for growth. I want to ask. I'm just really curious. Zoe said something that I'm just curious what the audience's reaction was to it. I can tell from reading through these questions that we actually have a very sophisticated audience here. These are fairly complicated questions that really get to the core of it. So this might not be as surprising to you as it would to the general public. But she mentioned that the United States fought a war, that China fought a war against America in Korea. I'm just curious. Show of hands. How many people does that surprise you? Because you thought that the Korean War was against Koreans. Did that surprise it? Yeah. So it's surprising, right? I mean, do you know, like all my friends in America, they say, oh, the Korean War, we saw MASH, right? The Korean War was between Koreans. Well, in China, they actually don't call the Korean War the Korean War. You know what they call it? They call it 抗美援朝. It means anti-American war to help the Korean people. So just perspective. We have a complicated history here with China for sure. And there's reason for a lot of these sensitivities. Ending this, come back to you. You have every right. The question was directed to you, so you have every right to chime in on it. But I would let's turn back to the economy and get your thoughts, because you just spent a fair bit of time in China and got a sense for what's going on the economic front. And also, I want to try to stir up a little bit of trouble here on the stage and create a little contention here. I'm going to quote from Zoe. So Zoe, and I want to get your reaction to it, Andy, if you will. So Dr. Liu just co-authored a piece in Foreign Affairs, and it's called "Who Killed the Chinese Economy?" And I pulled a quote, and you'll correct me if I've got this quote wrong, but I think it's right. Well before the pandemic, Xi's aggressive promotion of military-civil fusion strategy prompted U.S. leaders to enhance investment screening and export controls. These Western restrictions have raised the cost of his drive for technological supremacy, requiring the state to commandeer additional national resources. So I'm just curious. I mean, give us a sense for what you see going on over there, and if you feel like you're reacting to what Dr. Liu has said about that in Foreign Affairs.
Well, I really liked to hear that, because I spoke at an event this morning where I was blamed for killing the Chinese economy. So I think the Chinese economy got whacked on the head quite a bit over the last few years, but is starting to recover from its concussion. But I don't think the biggest problem was what the United States has been doing. I think that's been really tangential to the problem. The problem has been poor execution of economic and regulatory policies by Xi Jinping. But we also have to remember that he's not the first Chinese leader to screw it up. They all did, Deng Xiaoping included. Sometimes, when people tell me, Xi Jinping's doing such a horrible job, I'm like, weren't you the guy who was always complaining about how Hu Jintao never did anything? So yeah, we all have our problems with each leader, and serious mistakes were made. But I think that the key issue for most of us who are following what's happening in the Chinese economy right now is understanding why Xi Jinping made these mistakes. Has he made these mistakes because he is an ideologue who is ignorant of markets and wants to reverse all of the reforms that have happened in the Chinese economy over the last 4 decades? Or is he a guy who, in some cases, was trying to do admirable things, like help gig workers, for example, but just executed his admirable objectives in a really chaotic and non-transparent and horrible way? If you believe it's the first, that he's an ideologue, then there's good reason to give up hope. But I don't buy that at all for a few reasons. One is he's been running China for over a decade now, and I think we have a lot of evidence that he's not stupid. That there's clear evidence that he's seen throughout his life that the market reforms are the reason why he's running China today and why the Communist Party is still in control. Going back to what Orville was saying about the Soviet Union, I have a little bit of a different take in terms of how he viewed what happened in the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early days of Russia, which I think has been highly influential to his thinking. But my view from reading a lot of the things that he's said and written over the years is his takeaway from that was that they made some mistakes. And the key mistake was opening up on the political side too soon and too far, and making a lot of errors on the economic side. And so I think the lesson that he took out of the USSR-Russia example was, let's focus on the economics and maintain tight Leninist control over the governance system. And this is basically, I think, what Deng Xiaoping was advocating for in the early 90s after Tiananmen. Because And one of the problems that he's continually making, one of the mistakes he's continually making, I think, is if you listen to his speeches, and I don't recommend this, he sounds like he's running an economy that is socialist, that it's like the USSR in the old days where almost everyone worked for the state, except he's actually running an economy where 90% of employment is in small entrepreneurial private companies. All the new job creation is from those companies. All the innovation, all the wealth creation, all the strength of China is from those countries. But his rhetoric is like out of the 60s and 70s sometimes. So what I would advocate is patience. And what I think, when I talk about what I've taken away as a framework for thinking about China over the 40 years is two fundamental pillars. One is Chinese people are really resilient. They've been through an awful lot, not just in the last 40 years, but even worse in the 40 years before that. And Chinese leadership has been successful when they've been pragmatic on economic policy, not necessarily on political policy, but on economics. I think most Chinese people are pretty happy with the way things have evolved over time. Not everybody for sure, but the standard of living changed, the personal freedom changed. So I think we have to recognize the party itself has evolved a lot. When I first worked in China, the party told Chinese people where to go to school, what to study. When you left school, they assigned you to a job with the state. You had no say in that. If you wanted to get married, the party had to vet your choice of spouse. They assigned you to a house. You had to get a chit from the party to get a plane ticket or a train ticket. The party ran your life. Today, none of those things I've described apply to almost all Chinese people. There are some small exceptions to that in terms of the percentage of the population. The improvement in personal freedom and standard of living has been just phenomenal. And the party has voluntarily, and I think this is the first time a one-party regime has voluntarily given up control over that much of people's lives. So I'm trying to be patient and say, if Chinese people can be patient and resilient, I can be too. That let's keep engaging with China, because eventually they have, as I think you were alluding to, they've set themselves up on a course where this is unsustainable. But is it unsustainable over 10 years or 50 years or 100 years? I want to be patient and wait that out, because I think for us and for Chinese people, pushing it to an abrupt, premature head is likely to be really dangerous.
Thanks, Andy. I'm just looking through the questions here, and you actually just answered one of the questions I was going to bring up, but I'll give you an opportunity to comment if you want, but I'm going to shift it to Victor. The question, I'll just read it out real quick. He says, you said that Xi is there now. We should look at this as a bump in the road, but he has established himself as a leader for life. How long will we be feeling the bump? So this is a question that came from you all. Thanks for that. And Andy could comment if you'd like, but Victor, I wonder if you could tell us about some of the personnel shifts that we've seen in Beijing of late, and I'm referring to the disappearance of two ministerial level people, Li Shangfu and Qin Gang. This would be the equivalent of cabinet secretary people, just disappearing and being taken into custody. I wonder if you could comment on that, and also comment on what should we be looking for. You mentioned that no mystery about who's driving the bus, but who's on the bus and who's around, who else is there that we should be thinking about, and is there any cause for optimism about some of the people that are kind of the rising stars, the Han Zheng or the or Li Feng or people like this?
Well, I think we saw the upside of the current system of a lot of power being concentrated in the hands of one person, which is in 2020, 2021. China reacted to COVID very decisively, at least internally. China's not cooperating with global authorities. I think that still stands, but certainly within China, their effort to control COVID was extremely effective. And I think that a lot of it is because of the concentration of authority in the hands of Xi Jinping. And basically all the different parts of the government, including the military. So remember, this was an endeavor which mobilized all the different pieces of the regime, including local governments, the state council, large SOEs, and the military. And because all the power was decisively in the hands of Xi Jinping by that point, all the different pieces obeyed instantly. So remember, the lockdown happened sort of at the end of January in 2020. All the units in the Chinese government obeyed as one and very successfully controlled COVID in 2020 and 2021. So we saw the upside, but I think not just in economics, but also in political science, there's no free lunch, right? So any kind of political system that you have, and that includes democracy, and we're seeing some of the issues of democracy these days in the United States, certainly. In a sort of a strong dictatorship that China has, there's also no free lunch, right? So you do have the benefits of being able to make decisions very quickly, being able to enact policies very quickly, but very quickly you run into some trade-offs. And the trade-off is that, well, A, he's one person, and China is very complex, as we discussed. Does he have the expertise to make good decisions in every single policy area? I don't think any single person can do it. I mean, this is not a comment about him being smart or not smart or whatever. He could be the smartest person in the world. And, I think politically, certainly there's a lot of evidence that he's extremely smart and astute as a politician. It's just, there are a lot of complex policy issues and he can't possibly know everything about all these different issues. So then mistakes will manifest. He can choose to delegate some of this decision to other officials. And so these are the other people on the buses, but he seems not to want to do it, right? Because the problem is that once you start delegating, then these other officials can build up power bases of their own and potentially challenge your power. And if you want to keep the power in the long run, as he clearly does, you don't want to delegate too much, right? So I think there was some sense that there was some delegation to Wang Qishan, for example, during the first 10 years of his rule. And he's not very happy with that. As we can see, a lot of Wang Qishan people are sort of not in a happy place. So he doesn't want to delegate. He doesn't know everything. And then because he's so powerful, the other trade-off is that people who are advising him, they come to know what he likes to hear, and they only feed him that information, and that will lead to not optimal decision making. And I think we have seen some examples of that. I mean, I want to ask Zoe and Andy to comment. Like, to me, the 3 red lines, deleveraging real estate sector, all 3 of us could have told him that this will not work because it would have blown everything up. Why didn't anyone tell him that at that time, right? And he implements it. Everything starts to blow up a few months later, and then suddenly change comes like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening. It's like, of course this was going to happen. Like, we didn't know that Evergrande was going to blow up once you stop letting it borrow, trillions of renminbi, going forward. So it is kind of amazing. The other thing that I think is a little bit disturbing to me is that, as all of us on the stage knows, previous leaders of China, especially Zhu Rongji, cultivated a group of technocrats with a lot of international savvy as well as domestic technocratic knowledge. Most of those people are out. Not because they're in, well, some of them are in jail, indeed, but many of them, just aging out, retired. And the people replacing them, some of them are not especially impressive. They've gotten to their positions by just being very standard state bankers, doing their jobs, just obeying whatever orders come down from Beijing, but not especially innovative, not especially pushing for any kind of economic reform in the financial sector. The guy who's in charge of the entire financial sector, I mean, besides Xi Jinping himself, is known for starting the biggest property bubble in China, or financing it. So it's, but because he has the trust of Xi Jinping, he has that job, and so one wonders what the quality of decision making in the financial sector will be. So again, there are some very good aspects of the current political system, and we've seen it, but there are trade-offs.
Thanks for that. Victor, it's interesting you say about competence. That's something that, speaking for the foreign business community there in China, that's something we really felt, that early on, there was always this feeling that whether you agree or disagree with the direction of China, there was a lot of competence in sort of managing, if you remember the banking crisis, the NPLs, the non-performing loans, and they managed their way through that. And then really around 2014, 2015, just before the stock market crashed, we really felt like, what's going on? It's like that competence level is something that a lot of people commented on there in the business community. We are quickly running out of time, but there's a couple of topics that are really important that we need to get to. Again, I'm going to combine a question from the audience with my own question for Orville. We want to talk about, well, this question from the audience is, the West has accused China of IP theft. In your opinion, is the accusation correct? If yes, what can or should China do about it? And it's interesting. It's an interesting question. It's a complicated question because there's a lot of different aspects of IP theft, and I can kind of comment on that as far as what's going on within China. But it is an interesting question. Especially, I was on giving a talk yesterday, actually, on economic forecasting, and the people that I was talking about China and geopolitics, and then the next speakers were actually from the FBI. And they gave, I was talking about some fairly positive things having to do with business, with China and things like this, and these guys really gave us an earful about a certain aspect of IP theft, which is really the cyber spying, the gov-to-gov cyber spying that they spend a lot of time on. But so I wonder if Orville, if you or others want to comment on that question. But and while you're doing it, though, can you help us understand semiconductor, or give us some comments around semiconductors? I know your new book is about semiconductors, so it's going to be hard to kind of condense this to 3 or 4 minutes of discussion. But what is that about? And specifically about Taiwan, right? I mean, there's all these discussions about, the Taiwan, which is the source of 90% of our high-end semiconductors all come from Taiwan. So we have a real strategic weakness there in our supply chain. Others are saying, oh, no, wait, actually, this is literally a silicon shield, that China will never attack Taiwan because everybody needs semiconductors. What's your view? What can you tell us about that? And again, we are short on time. I apologize.
Yes, we are short on
Big
time.
topic.
I mean, this topic is a galactic topic. But let me simply say this. Everybody needs semiconductors. The semiconductor world is the child of globalization. Yeah. It is the personification of globalization. What do I mean by that? It means that everybody is in bed with everybody else on the supply chains of semiconductors. Taiwan's in bed with the PRC's in bed with America, Korea's in bed with Taiwan, America, and the PRC. It's a big globalized snarl, right? Born of those years when we thought, hey, we can get it quickly, it's well made, we don't have to keep inventories, we don't care where it comes from. Well, that world is just sort of had a train wreck. Yeah. Globalization is now being threatened, not just by the end of engagement, by many other things, by the invasion of the Ukraine. You can go on and on and on. So semiconductors are a kind of an area where we really don't know how to unsnarl ourselves from it. Decoupling, not that easy. Everybody's dependent on everybody. So to just remind ourselves of what Andy said about how important it is to try to work things out. Yes, semiconductors begs that of us. Can we work it out? Boy, we wrote a 300-page study on this, and not easy. And I think it's not easy precisely because of some of the things I said before, that in order for it to work out, the US and China would have to be able to resolve some other issues. And what is obstructing us from doing that is a sense of reciprocity, is a sense that we'll each give a little to get a little. We're in a very antagonistic frame of mind about each other. And I have to say, you know, you all have to decide what kind of a society would you like to live in? What are your obligations to your fellow human beings around the world when it comes to who gets locked up for no reason or who doesn't? Do you just say, hey, bring on the semiconductors? You know, not our job. All of these questions are now at play, and we just do not have answers for them. And China is not making it easy. It's very defensive about its system. That's what the term you hear again and again and again. We want mutual respect. China wants to be respected. Who doesn't? But are we able to respect a Leninist system that does all the various things you know about? It's difficult, and it's not going to happen easily by a democracy. So this is where we are, and it isn't that we haven't tried. It isn't that we don't have the will to work it out. It's just that the answer is not obvious.
And I think the discussion about semiconductors really brings us to this fundamental question about China's self-sufficiency, which really has always been a goal, and you know, in some sense, and for many of the reasons that we've been talking about, in some sense, for good reason. You know,
Yes, I would say, Kerr, there are two things about that yes, I mean, remember, Chairman Mao's, one of his primary principles was what he called self-reliance. And Xi Jinping has that needle in his arm. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy to accomplish. But it means he would like to be independent and self-reliant as he can be, but he wants one kind of dependency. He'd love to have us, Europe, other countries dependent on China. Why? Because that's leverage. And that's what Wolf Warrior diplomacy is all about, using economic leverage. So, you know, it's not like we're just so stupid or haven't tried hard enough to find the obvious answer that's hovering out there. I don't see one.
Thanks for that, Orville. We are past time, but by a fair bit. I apologize for that, but I want to end with the questions a little bit more fun. I like to kid Andy about the arrogance of U.S. government because of all his years in the State Department. But I want to I want Andy and Zoe to comment on this last question that came from the audience. And I think we can kind of have fun with it. And that is, how do cultural differences influence diplomatic relations between China and the United States, or could they be used for mutual benefit? So again, I kid Andy about because we have a lot of interactions with State Department people. And the U.S. government, frankly, it is arrogant. Let's be true. It can be. I'm not saying the Chinese government isn't, but what's your reaction to that? Are there cultural differences in diplomacy? And then I'll ask Zoe to have the last word.
It's an interesting question. Yeah, there's certainly cultural differences, and that I think was one of the most fun parts of being a diplomat, was figuring out how to work them out. But I would argue that the cultural differences of dealing with a French diplomat were even more complicated than dealing with a Chinese diplomat. But that's the fun part of trying to figure it out. But that's different from arrogance. And I think, if I can defend the State Department, I think or foreign service officers, career diplomats, I think the problem is not cultural differences, it's arrogance, but I think that comes from our political leadership rather than from career diplomats. And part of it is just our cultural history, that we generally as Americans have this view that God created us as the best country on the planet, and that we have a kind of a missionary attitude about that. We want to bring all the best parts of America to the rest of the world. But there's two ways of doing that, right? For example, one of the ways was we used to have this great program in the State Department of jazz ambassadors. I mean, I remember bringing a fantastic jazz group to travel around East Java in Indonesia. I mean, that's a great way to impress upon people the greatness of our culture and our history, as opposed to sometimes when I was instructed to go into another government someplace and say, you have to stop the following practices that you're doing at home because we don't like them. And sometimes my interlocutor would say, well, okay, but what about these things that you're doing at home? And then you get into this whataboutism. But on all of these issues, there are different ways of approaching them. And I think it's about the instructions that come down from the political leadership rather than the way the diplomats behave.
Got it. Zoe, anything you want to add to that? And again, Orville kind of brought up this idea of respect, that I think really permeates the discussion, with China. But your last comments.
Sure. I think the cultural aspect actually plays at both the state to state level, since there is the leaders summit here literally happening next week, and then it also happens at the people level, and in particular some common denominators at the leaders level. I'll just give one example. This is the part that shocked me a lot when I first came to the United States. I came to the United States back in 2011, and I encountered my very first campaign season in Washington, D.C. And when I literally realized that, oh, okay, so these are the future, American president coming on campus, starting to talk about things, I realized this never happened in China. And in China, across all these thousands of years, there is this one thing I think still lingering around today, which is Tianzi. The leader is supposed to be the son of heaven. Thank you, Victor. So, and they are supposed to talk in a very proic way that you don't understand. Normal people are not supposed to understand what the leaders are talking about. And this is why you find listening to President Xi Jinping and trying to understand what he's talking about is literally like reading a Latin version of the Bible, and I don't speak Latin. And but you don't see that in America. I think a lot of this become this high-level diplomatic relationship because create problems. And you need people, you need a career diplomat, you need people with local understanding because exactly as Oliver was talking about, there is no exact word like the engagement in China. Then how are you going to facilitate Americans to understand what exactly is the Chinese trying to communicate? The same for China. And then at the people level, I think there are lots of common denominators at the people's level. We are all sad when the pandas left this morning or yesterday morning. We were all sad about it, right? And then on the other hand, China, there are so many. NBA was extremely popular in China. So is NFL. So there are a lot of common cultural is not always a barrier. There are things that we can work things out, and that goes back to the culture. My relatively optimistic along the spectrum of pessimism people. There are things that we can work out, and perhaps the cultural is one area. In addition to Victor's point in terms of climate and environment and global health.